Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te Kapunga Jews ahau, te tō o whenua oho. This is another one of our Wānanga Bites, and the centre focus for this Wānanga Bite is myth busting. A few myths that go around the country at the moment in and around pines in particular and afforestation. So I thought I'd start with a whenua Māori and a whenua oho view, that as Māori we prefer indigenous forests. As whenua oho we prefer indigenous forests. Unfortunately, and rightly or wrongly, more wrongly than rightly perhaps, pine has the ability to enable other activities through wealth generation, which currently, under the current frameworks, Indigenous isn't able to do for us. That's not something that we're necessarily happy about, it's just the way it is right now. So because a number of our Māori clients need money, need to create financial wealth in order to execute against their aspirations, which might be papakainga, which might be Indigenous establishment or things like that, we felt that it was appropriate to discuss some of the myths around pines, simply to allow for our Māori landowners to choose pines to enable their aspirations if appropriate, rather than basing their decision making on incorrect activity or incorrect information. So the first myth, that pine ruins soils, that pine is bad for soil health. This unfortunately is not an evidence-based assertion. There was a study conducted by Scion between 2009 and 2013, and that measured soil fertility, soil organic reserves, the pH levels in forested areas, and the physical status of soils. So to start with, 50% of the forest soils that were in pine forests met those targets. By comparison, only 18% of pasture sites met those targets, and only 13% of the dairy sites that were measured met those targets. So I guess from using that type of evidence-based, we can see that for the most part, soils in forested areas are much better than soils on pasture lands. We certainly accept that before there's canopy closure, so before the pine canopy closes over, that the landscape tends to look a bit raw. However, forests tend to be planted on less arable, steeper country, and that's where we plant our forests today, and appropriately so. So not disputing that they look a bit raw, but the evidence shows that our soils are improved through afforestation, not made worse. So myth number two, that pine creates acidic soils. Once again, simply not evidence-based. All forests tend to be acidic, and that includes Indigenous forests. So it's pretty likely that this myth stems from a farming preference to having alkali soils because they're better for pasture. So that's normally an outcome of top dressing by lime to lower the acidity levels. So in terms of actual measurements, a pine or an Indigenous forest would have an acidity between 5.1 and 5.6. Pasture would have an acidity between in and around the 5.9 and 6.0. And just by way of comparison, maize would prefer a soil type that is more alkaline, again at around 6.3. So is pine creating acidic soils? That's just simply not so. Myth number three, multiple rotations of pine trees degrade soils. Once again, not evidence-based. Repeated research by Scion shows that the second and third rotation, there is no decline in soil health, there is no decline in soil nutrition. It is absolutely accepted that post-harvest there is a window of vulnerability around the soils. However, most of that can be mitigated. So I guess in summary, multiple rotations do not degrade the soil, which is a science-based outcome. Myth number 4, pines remove too much water from the waterways. Funnily enough, that's true. Pines do remove water from waterways. The analogy, however, is that all forests remove water from waterways, and that includes indigenous. So as water is caught by leaves and trees, the water is taken up by the trees to assist with growth. So this is all trees, not just pine trees. So any afforestation on an area that was previously pasture land will return the area to what it was pre-clearing, so what it was pre-colonisation, if you like, if replanted at a catchment level. So that said, forests can capture and can recharge aquifers and maintain flows in dry seasons better than pasture land, provided the bedrock structures allow for that, and the impact of flooding is minimised in an afforested area versus a pasture land, as evidenced by any number of aerial photographs that you could see around Cyclone Bowler in the 80s and the flooding that occurred around Whanganui in the early 2000s. The summary is all forests remove more water from the waterways than pasture land, but remembering that 95% of our country was covered in forests before colonisation. Myth number 5, that pines ruin water quality. Once again, not an evidence-based assertion. All forests improve water quality, indigenous and pine. All forests remove sedimentation and nutrient loss. All forests improve waterway temperatures, nutrient and sediment concentrations, microbial contamination caused by farming, and a newly established pine forest that starts showing up somewhere between the ages of 4 and 6. There is other more visual impact evidence of this, in that tuna and koura will be found in afforested waterways, whether that's pine or indigenous. And those two species are highly unlikely to be found in pasture waterways. Just a little plug in here, even riparian planting can help with this in pasture land, but certainly afforestation will help a lot more. Myth number 6, there is no biodiversity in pine forests. Another non-evidence-based assertion. All forests improve biodiversity. That includes indigenous and pine forests. If we were to summarise, it would be true to say that there is more diversity in native landscapes. That is absolutely so. What is absolutely so also is that there is much more biodiversity found in a pine forest than in a manuka forest, or more biodiversity in a pine forest than there is on a pasture land. Just by way of facts, in a pine forest, at least 120 threatened indigenous species can be found. This includes the kiwi and the kārearea, both of New Zealand's rare bats, tōtara and various carnivorous snails, Archie's frog, and the list goes on. So is biodiversity threatened in a pine forest? Compared to a native forest is by far better. Compared to pasture land, pine forests are by far and away have more biodiversity. Myth number 7. Aged or 100-year-old pine forests will fall over for whatever reason. Once again, not an evidence-based assertion. A related myth is that pines are shallow-rooted compared to other trees, which is simply not true. natives of the similar size of pine trees have the similar rooting structures. There are also pine forests in New Zealand that are over 100 years that are still thriving. So, dare I say, anti-pine campaigns very cleverly use the wording like there is concern over 100-year-old pine forests on our skeletal soils, which infers that there's a problem without saying that there actually is. We're using words like concern. The reality is there is no science to support that pine forests will all fall over once they hit 100 or 120 years old. At a personal level, my comment to that would be that Indigenous cover would absolutely be preferable. And when we can monetise that Indigenous coverage, then we should absolutely be endeavouring to establish more Indigenous. And in fact, if we can afford it, we should be trying to do that now. However, at the moment, pine forests are of benefit to our environmental outcomes in New Zealand. They're of benefit to soil and water quality, erosion control, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration. So by comparison to pasture, any type of forest is better from that perspective. So in summary, there are a lot of misconceptions floating around about pine and pine forests. A lot of that's driven by change, which is occurring at the moment, and there's also a lot that's driven by some very effective campaigning by the likes of Beef and Lamb New Zealand and Dairy NZ, who favour agriculture over afforestation, and arguably for their constituency that's completely understandable. However, that doesn't make some of the assertions that come through from organisations like that to be so. So I hope that some of those myth-busting comments that I've made have been useful. Whānau, at the risk of shameless self-promotion, please like and share our Facebook page. Any questions, please post comments below, or even better, go onto our website, get our contact details, send us an email, send us a question form, give us a call if you do have any questions. And in closing, we are having an online wānanga on the 17th of December. That'll be live at 10 a.m. That will talk to whenua oho, our service offering, and how we can help our Māori landowners achieve their aspirations on their whenua as relates to both forestry and horticulture. Nā reira, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Ka kite.